Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak. The subject is constitutional militia. Why is that subject important? Well, with Samuel Johnson, I believe, who quipped, nobody really focuses his mind more forcefully than on his impending hanging. And this country, of course, is confronted with all sorts of dire problems and even potential crises for which Americans are prepared if they're prepared. When you think of natural disasters, those earthquakes and crop failure, food, industrial accidents, technological failure, breakdown of electrical grids. Now, something people are talking about a disastrous failure for nuclear power plants, such as happened in Japan. That's the oil spills. You think of some other situations that are going on. Widespread police misconduct, cases of police brutality, crime all the internet, potential collapse of the monetary banking system, dishonest elections across the country. Well, if constitutional militia existed in every state, these problems could be really addressed, and solutions could be proposed and be put into practice. Our problem is that constitutional militia do not exist in any state in this country. And from the past record, you can state that the present hodgepodge of bureaucratic emergency management agencies that have been set up at every level of the federal system really cannot be expected to provide sufficient, adequate protection against these dangers, especially collapse of the monetary and banking systems, because as far as I know, no emergency management plans exist at all, anywhere in this country, with respect to that particular problem. So if Americans are to be protected as usual, they must protect themselves. And constitutional militia are the only institutions which can provide the means to do so. Which is why constitutional militia must be revitalized in this country, in every state, as expeditiously as possible, or as I like to say, immediately, if not soon. Now that brings us to the centrality of definitions for the concept that specific words, specific meanings. Now the subject of this particular talk is constitutional militia, and the adjective is crucial. Now to define and understand what a constitutional militia is, we can't rely on generalities found in popular dictionary. And we can't rely even on definitions that may be found in statutes, because any statute is valid only to the extent that it is consistent with the Constitution and not otherwise. And we certainly cannot rely on definitions that are supplied by proponents of so-called private militias or opponents of private militias, because they have their own tendentious political agendas that they're pushing. One thing we can say, constitutional militias can never be unorganized. As a constitutional militia can never have no practical existence or operations at all. Constitutional militia are not and cannot be private institutions. Constitutional militia are not and cannot be to any degree anti-governmental in character, in purpose, or in their actions. To the contrary, constitutional militia are quintessentially governmental institutions. They are the embodiments and the executors of the highest form of government, with popular sovereignty. Constitutional militia, integral and permanent component of America's federal system of government. Specifically, constitutional militia are governmental institutions of the several states, which can be called upon to perform certain vital functions for the United States and otherwise serve their own states. Well, now you know more on this subject than probably 99% of the population of this country. Perhaps I could stop here, but I won't, because we need to understand why these statements are correct. Well, to do that, we have to consult the Book of Instructions for this country, which is, of course, the Constitution. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, Bill of Rights ratified in 1791, so we really need to put ourselves back into that era, understand the terms of the Constitution in the way that the people in that time understood. Well, let's begin with the Second Amendment, because that's where most people who are proponents of the so-called right to keep and bear arms start, and it's also where they end. The The modern proponents of gun rights tend to focus on the last 14 words of the amendment as opposed to the first 13 words. Now that's a fundamental mistake because the Second Amendment is composed of just one sentence. And it certainly is a rule of the English language, and I imagine of every other language, that you cannot take a sentence and excise part of it and focus on the rest of it and assume that you are obtaining the full meaning that's built into that sentence through the use of all of its terminology. Now, the first 13 words of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, form what in grammar is called an absolute clause. And an absolute clause, quite often, tells us the most important things about the purpose of a particular sentence, or in this case, purpose of this amendment. Now, anyone who remembers high school Latin is familiar with absolute, used over and over again in the Latin language. Classic example: Caesar, having put his legions to Gaul, the Belgae were fearful and fled across the plain. Now, what is the important part of that sentence? Well, it's probably not that the Belgae fled across the Rhine because they were fearful, because they may have done that on many occasions. It was the fact that Caesar brought his legions into Gaul that made them fearful and made them flee. So if we look at the Second Amendment, those first 13 words really tell us the purpose of the whole amendment. And let's look at them piecemeal. Well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. Well, what is a free state? Well, that's the goal of the Constitution. It's the goal of the Bill of Rights. It's the goal of the Declaration of Independence. Basically, it's popular sovereignty or representative government. And we can look into the original Constitution, Article 4, Section 4, the United States guaranteed every state in this union a republican form of government, and we can see that concept of a free state presented there. A representative government is one based upon popular sovereignty, where the people control, and usually through representatives that they have selected, exercise those powers in the governmental apparatus. Second word of consequence of well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Well, there are no limits on that word. Any kind of security that's relative to the preservation of a free state is within the ken of a well-regulated militia. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Interestingly enough, the militia is the only institution that the Constitution explicitly states is necessary for any purpose. The Constitution doesn't say Congress is necessary, the President is necessary, the court system is necessary. Absolutely not. The only institution is the militia. And that clause is in the present tense. A well-regulated militia being necessary. Not that a militia may have been necessary in the past or might be necessary under some unknown conditions in the future, but is necessary right now at all times under all contingencies and for all purposes. Well, that brings you, of course, to those three words, well-regulated militia. And those are not defined in the Second Amendment. But what we can see is that the following 14 words, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, must have some instrumental connection to a well-regulated militia, which serves this purpose ultimately of securing a free state. And in fact, it's fairly obvious that a well-regulated militia is one that is composed of people who are exercising the right to keep and bear arms. I mean, you don't even have to know much history to read that out of the Second Amendment. Well, the Second Amendment doesn't appear alone in the Constitution, so let's go back to the original Constitution, the Constitution that was ratified in 1788. We already pointed out that a free state and a republican government are congruent. Now I look at the concept of security. Security of a free state, relating to a militia. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Congress has the power to provide, calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Well, those are three vital security functions. Repel invasions, maintain national sovereignty, national existence, suppress insurrections, deal with riots, civil war perhaps, execute the laws of the Union, where you can't have a free state without the rule of law, and you can't have the rule of law without the execution of the laws. So all of these things tie together, but they are limited. Right? Congress's authority to of the militia is limited to 3 specific purposes. Now, interestingly, it's called forth. Called forth from where? Where are the militia supposed to be called forth from? Well, we'll see that, Now, if we go to the concept of the well-regulated militia, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, Congress has the power to provide for organizing, arming, disciplining militia. This is a very interesting language, which I will quote exactly. And for governing such part of them may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of the training of the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So here we have elements of regulation, organizing, arming, disciplining, governing, training. And the one thing that's quite obvious from this provision is these elements of well-regulation, because we'll assume that Congress will do it properly, they are well-regulation that is exercised through statutes. This is not something that private individuals do on their own. This is something that Congress embodies in a statute to achieve these purposes, and that it can provide for only through a statute. Now notice regulation by Congress can provide only for those 3 purposes: executing the laws of the Union, the states, suppressing insurrections and repelling invasions. And notice also that it refers to the militia in the plural, such part of them. Get that in a moment. Furthermore, when the militia are called forth, they are employed in the service of the United States. That is, the militia are not entities of the United States government in the same way that the Army is, or the Navy is, or some federal agency might be. They can be employed in the service of the United States, but they are not entities of the United States. And finally, we have the recognition of basic principles of federalism. Yes, Congress can provide for these kinds of regulation, but who is going to appoint the officers? Who is going to see to the discipline and the training? The states. And there's a fundamental reason for that, which we find if we go to the next provision of the Constitution that deals with the militia, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, among the powers of the President. The President of the United States is given the status of Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. So there we have bipartite power of the President. He's always the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. He becomes Commander-in-Chief of the militia only in certain states. The service of the United States, one of those 3 institutional purposes. Notice the terminology, militia of the several states. This is where we get to the plural concept of the militia. The militia of the several states. How many states are there? 50 states. How many were there when the Constitution was ratified? 13. How many militia were there in 1788? 13. How many are there supposed to be today? 50. There's supposed to be 1 in each state. These are state institutions, just like a state legislature or a state executive or a state judiciary. Right? And the militia can be called into the service of the United States only for 3 purposes. What's interesting in the presidential part dealing with the militia is the use of the word actual. He becomes Commander-in-Chief of the militia only when the militia are called into the actual service of the United States. Why did they put the word actual there? Did they really need it? Well, probably not, except to emphasize that this service could not be fictitious. It could not be feigned. It could not be some form of usurpation that Congress or the President was trying to foist off on the militia. It had to be the actual service within constitutional boundaries. And who was supposed to determine that? Well, the militia, of course, because the President could be the usurper. Congress could be the usurpers, right? And who are the officers of the militia other than the President? Well, they're appointed by the states. So they might be the governors, more likely the governors of the people. Right? They're appointed by the states. And therefore, the states would have the final word on whether their militia could be called forth or would come forth, really, to perform functions in the employment of the United States where there was a question about the actual constitutional service being involved. So we have another check and balance built into the system, and actually a much better check and balance than is typically looked at, say, the 10th Amendment, because here it lays out exactly what the differentiations of authority are. Now, the difficulty we have here, even with the original Constitution, is that the terms dealing with regulation are not completely defined. organize, arm, discipline, train, govern, leave a certain amount of leeway there. How do we know what those definitions should be? Well, let's put ourselves again back into 1788, to that context, and we can say with, I think, apodictic certainty that every free adult male in the United States, each of the several states, knew precisely what those terms mean in terms of the militia, because every free adult male in the United States was either serving in the militia in one state or another, or he had served in the militia at one time or another. He had experienced this, and that experience went back generated in some states and colonies for over 100 years. The women probably knew this as well, because the women weren't required to serve in the militia. Many of them had financial obligations to the militia. Of course, their husbands, sons, and so forth were serving in the militia. So where do we look historically for this experience? The answer is the statutes. They created and well regulated the militia during the period which the states were independent, and earlier when the states were colonies. And we will find dozens and dozens of these statutes. They were constantly writing them in the colonies, constantly writing them in the independent states, from whenever the colonies began, from the very charters that began the existence of the colonies through the War of Independence and the writing of the Constitution. And what you discover in these statutes is that basically they are all the same. The basic principles of well-regulation, if you will, are uniform across the colonies and across the independent states. And of course, that's hardly surprising, because where these colonies come from? Well, they all came basically from England, and so they were applying English law and English principles and so forth, and you would expect the same principles would be applied. The one area where they went, luckily for us, beyond English principles, was to make the militia truly democratic institutions, that everyone was a member, other than the slaves. Of course, you couldn't arm slaves, and other than the women, because the social mores and theological principles did not allow for women to participate in military and paramilitary organizations. So all the free adult male, whatever station and status in society, were part of these institutions. You did not have the separation of nobles versus commons that had been the history of England. And that may have been the mistake that the English made, that they didn't impose that system on us. So the militia very quickly became democratic institutions which recognized what their real legal authority and physical power was. And that gave those people a completely different mindset, if you will, a different attitude than was held by the average man back in England. So if we look at these statutes, we can draw certain principles. I wrote a book called The Sword and Sovereignty, available on Amazon as everything is, which goes through in great detail some of these statutes and draws out a number of principles. Let's take a look at them. The first one is that the militia of the several states are based upon each person's individual, and especially the community's collective rights, powers, privileges, immunities, and duties of self-defense under laws of nature and nature's God. Now, this draws directly from the Declaration of Independence. The authority of the people, popular sovereignty, how is this going to be exercised in the ultimate extreme? When government turns to usurpers, they turn to tyrants, they attempt to impose despotism, and the people have the right and the duty to throw off such governments. How do they do that? Well, it's through a militia structure, basically. Military structure, paramilitary structure. Second principle, the militia of the several states perform critically important political function of enforcing the state, both in ordinary, especially in extraordinary times. And we know this even in ordinary times, because what is the first responsibility of the militia stated in the Constitution? Execute the laws of the Union. Right? That's the political and legal task of enforcing popular sovereignty through the legal system. Third principle, the militia of several states consist of separate and independent establishments which must exist in every state throughout the United States. Well, of course, that was the history. They were separate and independent, each colony, each independent state, and under the Articles of Confederation, and they have made that and recognized as that under the Constitution, named the militia of the several states. The militia of the several states, the next principle is our governmental institutions. They're not private institutions. It's part of the governments of the states, and ultimately they can be used, employed by the government of the United States, and subject to statutory regulation. Private institutions, what they call themselves, can never aspire to claim the constitutional authority of the militia in several states. In fact, quite the opposite. The reason that private institutions can exist at all is because we have a constitutional system in this country. Experts, the militia of the several states must always be identified as the militia of a particular state and by no other name. Well, that's of course the history. The militia of Virginia, the militia of Rhode Island, the militia of New York, whatever they were. And should be the same today. Why? Because that's what they're called in the Constitution. And if one wants to claim constitutional authority, you'd better use the constitutional name for that. Now, I have talked to various legislators in different states in the country about revitalizing the militia, and I always get from them, well, why do we have to call this militia? Let's call it the Home Guard. Let's call it the State Guard. Let's give it some other name. Because if we start using the word militia, some of these left-wing groups are going to be attacking us because we're attempting to engage in some kind of anti-government activity or whatever. And what I point out to them is, if you call it by some other name, how can you claim the constitutional authority for it? The Constitution doesn't recognize an institution called the Home Guard or an institution called the State Guard. So what are these things? Well, if they're the militia, call them the militia. If they're not, then they're going to have some other authority, lesser authority, and lesser responsibility than the militia. You cannot play word game in the Constitution, no matter what the Supreme Court likes to do. At least you can't do it legitimately. Next principle, the militia of several states must always be strictly differentiated from the regular Army and Navy of the United States and from the troops or ships of war that the states keep in time of peace with against Congress. Now they are in the Constitution. There are different provisions in the original Constitution dealing with the Army and the Navy, and different provisions dealing with the militia. And the militia were always understood to be in check and balance against a standing army. Founding fathers were very suspicious of a standing army, and that's why in the Army provision of the Constitution they say, well, Congress can raise armies, but the appropriations can last only 2 years. Why? So that every new House of Representatives elected every year would have the opportunity to refuse appropriations for a standing army, and therefore the standing army would be eliminated because there'd be no money to fund it. That's not the case of the militia, because the militia is the institutions. So we have the Army on the one side, we have the militia on the other side. The militia is composed of all of the people. The Army is composed of volunteers and professional organizations. And we have something in the middle called the state's troops or ships of war. And you have to remember that during the Revolutionary War period, the independent states raised their own armies. And they raised their own navies in addition to the militia. And they supplied troops to the Continental Army, and they supplied forces to the Continental Navy. When the Constitution was written, Congress wanted to cut back on that. So in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, they provided that no state shall keep troops or ships of war in time of peace without the consent of Congress. Now, they're not talking about the militia there, because the militia are permanent entities. They're talking about regular armies and regular navies. So under that provision, Congress and the states could agree for the states to keep troops or ships of war in time of peace. And Congress, as a condition of its consent, or the states they're agreeing, would set certain standards for that. And in fact, Congress has done this. It's called the National Guard, or the naval militia is another term that's used. That's a statute that was passed in 1903, more than 100 years after the Constitution was ratified. The National Guard has nothing to do with the militia. The naval militia, although it's called that, has nothing to do with it. They are the state troops, ships of war that Congress has agreed may be kept in time of peace by the states. And as a result of that agreement by Congress, they have all sorts of responsibilities and duties that cannot be imposed upon the militia. Militia have only 3 purposes for which they can be called for by Congress. There are many more purposes for which the National Guard can be called for. Militia can't be sent off to France or other countries to fight in foreign wars. The National Guard has been and can. Militias made up of essentially the entire population on a compulsory basis. The National Guard is made up of volunteers, people who sign enlistment contracts. I go on and on and on about the distinctions, but it's clear the National Guard is something entirely different from the militia, it's something different from the Army. It falls into this third category, but it becomes an adjunct of the Army because of the consent of Congress and agreement of the states in setting it up. Whereas the militia never can become an adjunct of the Army, because who appoints the officers of the militia? It's the state governments. The armed forces officers by the President and the Senate. So they can never command the militia. Completely different set of circumstances. Another principle, Congress, the states, and we the people ultimately must ensure that each and every one of the militia of the several states is fully organized, armed, disciplined, and trained at all times. There is no such thing constitutionally as an unorganized militia. Impossible. You go back and look at the history of the militia throughout the colonial period, throughout the period of the independent states, there was no such thing. They organized everyone to the extent that they could do it. Why? Because the principle was that everyone in the community owed some duty to participate in the defense of the community. There was no group that was going to be let out of that on a privileged basis. So you had near universal membership, which is another principle, compulsory participation, which is part of that, and then some kind of reasonable equality in the individual's burdens of service. Not everyone was going to perform the same functions, but everyone was going to perform some function appropriate to their abilities. Now, service in the militia is subject to certain kinds of limited exemptions. Those limited exemptions have to perform some function related to the common defense of the general welfare. So look at the example in the colonial period, the period of independent states. There were two categories of people who could receive limited exemptions. They were members of the militia. They had a compulsory requirement to participate, but they were given certain exemptions. One category, people in public office, legislators, judges, maybe clerks of certain kinds, sometimes sheriffs, sometimes constables. Why? Because it was felt that the functions these people were performing were so vital to the community that they would not be required to perform all the regular functions of the militia. Now, that didn't exclude them from the militia, because in wartime, in terms of alarm, as the term was used in those statutes, you'd find members of the legislature and some of these other officers, they'd turn up as officers in the militia. They just didn't have to come out and perform all the day-to-day functions of the militia because they had this other set of functions to perform. Then in the private sphere, you had people such as millers and ferrymen. Why were they excluded? Well, these were primarily agricultural societies. The miller performed a vital function. He wasn't there at the mill knowing how to use that equipment. The grain wouldn't be ground. And that would create all sorts of problems. Ferryman similar. He was in a nexus or a nub or a neck of the funnel in the transportation network. Someone had to be there operating that ferry on a 24-hour basis. So these people were exempted. Physicians and surgeons tended to be exempted from the normal functions. But when the militia were called out, where do you think the militia received their medical assistance? Well, from those physicians and surgeons. Ministers tended to be exempted. Pastors of churches were talking. But who was the first man who turned out with a gun in Concord on the 19th of April, 1775? He was the town minister. If they had a university or a college, professors and sometimes students were exempted. But they would probably have some other duties, such as buying guns for someone else in the militia. And in the slave states, people such as overseers had to be exempted. Why? Because the slaves had to be kept under supervision. Right? They had that problem in those days. But every one of these exemptions related to a function which was considered to be vital to maintaining some kind of community stability, community defense. Now, another principle is that the militia in several states are vested in the constitutional authority to provide protection to the community, whether that's political, economic, social, military, whatever is necessary to the security of the free state. The militia can provide, except with respect to the national government, where they're given only 3 security purposes. And that's primarily so that real security in this country will be provided where? At the state level, federalism. We want to have as much security provided by local people to their local communities as possible. We don't want to have to rely on higher levels at the governmental table of organization to supply security. Number one, because they're not on the scene. Number two, because they probably don't have the local knowledge. They don't have the local sympathies. They don't necessarily have the local abilities. Right? And by the time they show up, more damage will have been done than if people had been organized on the local level to deal with whatever emergency might arise. Because, of course, all emergencies in the final analysis operate at the local level. Somebody at the local level is going to be affected by that emergency. Next principle, unless specifically exempted, all members of the militia of the several states must acquire, maintain, and be supported by public authorities in their maintenance of and personal possession of firearms, ammunition, and other accoutrements appropriate to their militia service. And they may acquire, or experts look, they may acquire and possess and own, of right, any kind of firearm that's appropriate to militia service. And the third related principle is that they must have untrammeled access to acquire this material in the free market. Now, why is all this true? Well, it's true, number one, because you want people to have the firearms in their possession locally, because that's where the emergency arises. That's where they may need them immediately. You don't want to have to go to some armory or have to wait until they're trucked in from some distant location. But number two is that there could arise a situation in which the militia would be pitted against usurpers and aspiring tyrants in public office. And therefore, you certainly don't want the usurpers and aspiring tyrants to have control over the source of the very firearms and ammunition that the militia would have to use to oppose these people. And therefore, you want the militia to have access to the free market in order to be able to obtain this equipment and to maintain the equipment in their own personal possession at home. And that's exactly what happened in the colonial period, the period of independent states. People depended upon the free market. They were required by the statutes to purchase their own firearms unless they were too poor. And then they were usually given a firearm by the town or sometimes by the militia. But if they had the economic wherewithal, they were required to purchase their own firearms in the free market and maintain them in the free market, the use of gunsmiths or what have you, so that they would be capable of being called out for their regular training and service. And what's interesting, if we look at the history of that, how it evolved, the statutes changed the requirements as technology developed. So in the early days, they would tell people to buy a matchlock or snap hands, forms of firearms, and then some sort of firelock came in, the precursor of the flintlock, and the flintlock, and those were called the firelocks. And that went on, my gosh, beyond the Constitution through the Napoleonic Wars. The standard arm. So you see all of those being mentioned in the statutes as time goes along because they wanted the militiamen to have what was the equivalent of the armed forces of the British Army, because they had to operate in conjunction with the British Army during the colonial period, and of the French Army, or the Spaniards, or sometimes the pirates that they had to deal with, because the French were armed that way and the Spanish were armed that way. So they had firearms and equipment that was equivalent to whatever the military forces had, and basically that was the flintlock musket. And then along came the rifled musket, primarily in the, shall we say, the frontier areas of the various colonies. And that was then adopted. Very interesting example, Virginia, War of Independence, after a couple of militia statutes, and they specifically refer to the people who lived to the west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Those people were going to use rifles, whereas everyone else could use a musket. Why was that? Well, those people west of the Blue Ridge Mountains were the frontiersmen. They were hunters. They had to deal with hostile Indians. They used rifles all the time. They developed specific tactics for using those rifles, and they wanted them in the militia using the arms with which they were familiar, which in fact were superior to the typical musket. And you think of examples of the Revolutionary War where this occurred, the Battle of Kings Mountain, or the Battle of Saratoga, where riflemen played a vital role, and militiamen among them played that vital role. Now we compare this, of course, to modern gun control. Modern gun control, like militia structure, wants to keep as many guns out of the hands of as many people, many times and in many places, as quickly as possible for as long as possible. That's what it's aiming, to disarm as many people as possible completely, and especially to disarm people of the type of firearms that they would use if they were performing a military or paramilitary function, suppressing insurrections or repelling invasions. And that's why we have these statutes around the country, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, dealing with the so-called assault weapon, assault rifle, banning these, they be registered or whatever. The very rifle would be used by a militiaman if you were performing those two functions, probably in conjunction with the regular army if we were talking about an invasion, right? So we have whole legislatures in the country that are essentially spitting in the face, not only of the Second Amendment, but of the original Constitution's militia provision. They're doing exactly the opposite of what the original Constitution requires, and what Congress should be telling the states to do, and certainly in violation of the Second Amendment. Another principle, every member of the militia must be trained to participate in the provision of some aspect of Homeland Security for his state and locality, as well as for the United States. So Congress could require people to be trained so that they could resist and repel invasions, suppress insurrections, and execute the laws of the Union. And that kind of training would obviously be useful at the state level. The state might have insurrections or riots, and the militia could be called upon to execute the laws of the states, and be using essentially the same techniques for doing that. But the states might have areas of security which are not covered in those three areas for which Congress can call forth the militia. And so there would be special training with respect to those in the states, dealing with natural disasters, dealing with situations, as I suggested before, alternative currency, the breakdown of the monetary and banking systems, right? Well, that speaks to the point of where we are now, which from the constitutional perspective is nowhere. We have no constitutional militia set up in any of these. We have the National Guard, which consists of the troops of ships of war under Section 8 Clause 3. We have the Army and the Navy. Basically have the statutes put people who aren't in the National Guard in a category called the unorganized militia, which of course is an impossibility, constitutional impossibility. And certainly does not prepare people for doing anything to protect themselves against all of these potential problems, right? If you're unorganized, it's exactly that. You're unorganized. You're sitting in your own home watching television, but you're not being trained, you're not being equipped, you're not going out and practicing preparation for dealing with these kinds of emergencies. So what do we need to do now? Well, the term I use is revitalize the militia, that is, bring them back into the status that they should have. And that can be done relatively simply, because we can certainly draft the statutes with models from the colonial period. We know what the basic principles are, so we can draft those statutes. And we can segregate the National Guard, put it in its proper place in the statute. One of the things that would happen immediately is all of the emergency management, police, sheriff's departments, law enforcement agencies of that kind would all be brought immediately into the militia. So we don't have to redo those. We just change the bureaucratic structures under which they're organized. And they become subsets of the militia in the same way as the Rangers were during the colonial period or during the period of the War of Independence. They would perform the same functions they perform now. They would receive compensation and the various benefits that they receive now, but they would do this under the auspices and under the control of the militia, which would bring them totally under the control of the local community. They would not be separate bureaucratic institutions. And that's very important when you're dealing with questions such as police misconduct. You don't want these people in a separate position. You don't want them thinking that they are superior to the community. You want them recognizing that they have a responsibility or duty to the community, and the community has the right to supervise and control them. Vitally important, and that's something that would be corrected immediately. The whole police misconduct problem would be probably corrected in 30 days if such a statute were enacted. Now, the difficulty, of course, is most people in this country have no experience in this. They don't know anything about it. So if you pass a statute immediately that imposed on the average person, even the relatively limited duties that were imposed on people in the colonial era, I think the average person would say, no, I don't want to do this. I'm going to oppose this. So we don't want to start that way. Pass a statute that says, well, everyone has a duty in the militia, recognize that. And the average person, the only requirement is he's going to have to take, he or she will have to take some kind of course work each year. An hour, 2 hours a day, of course. And otherwise, we will farm out militia responsibilities to what are called independent companies. I've written about this in great detail in a book called The Sword and Sovereignty. It worked during the colonial era, it could work now. Once we have this structure set up and show that it works, we will gradually bring more and more people into it. And the beauty of our situation today is we have so many people in this country with so many diverse skills and talents that we really don't have to organize everyone fully. We have to organize everyone in terms of recognizing their responsibility and some basic training, and then we can turn over most of the hard work, the heavy lifting, to what essentially amount to volunteer units. So that's the constitutional militia. If anyone has a question, I'll be glad to entertain it, try to give an answer. Oh, defense force. All right. Let's see. If you read, and you can start, you begin to see this in 1916 is where it starts. In the section of the statute 1916 that deals with the National Guard, Congress also put in a provision dealing with state defense forces. And that provision says a state may raise no troops other than the National Guard, other than a state defense force. These state defense forces are really adjuncts of the National Guard. They're part of this troops, ships of war the states may keep in time of peace with the consent of Congress, because otherwise Congress wouldn't have had to consent to that. If the state defense forces were part of the militia, no congressional consent is required. And if you look at the way these state statutes typically work, the state defense forces are called up to fill in some gap when the National Guard people are sent out of the state. So in Virginia, they'd be called up to deal with traffic control, to take over the guard armories and that type of thing. So they really don't perform a militia function. Now, sometimes you get real confusion in the statutes, as in Virginia. You have an unorganized militia section. That's everybody who isn't in the National Guard or in the State Defense Force. And the governor is given a laundry list of emergencies in which he can call up the unorganized militia in some way. That isn't made clear how he's supposed to do that. And of course, they're unorganized, untrained, unequipped, and so forth and so on. So we have a real problem. But the statute says that if and when the unorganized militia people are called up, they become part of the Virginia Defense Force. Well, this is impossible even under the congressional statute, but it's also impossible under the Constitution, because if the Virginia Defense Force is part of the troops or ships of war the state may keep in time of peace with the consent of Congress, it's not part of the militia, and the militia cannot be made part of it. See, the problem is this was all thrown together piecemeal. They passed a little bit here, and they passed a little bit there, and no one ever sat back and said, wait a minute. What are we really doing here? How does this really fit into the Constitution? What are the principles we're supposed to be applying? And so you have the National Guard created in 1903 because they wanted to add an adjunct to the Army, be able to call up a large reserve for the Army. And they know they couldn't do that through the militia. So they created the National Guard, and they played a bait and switch game with verbiage, really, and called the National Guard the organized militia and everyone else the unorganized militia. And then they came along and they thought, well, wait a minute, we're going to need something besides the National Guard, so they created this thing called the State Defense Force. And then some of the states looked around and said, well, we may have situations where we might have to need more people than the National Guard. Oh, we'll call up your unorganized militia. But they don't say how they're going to do that. I mean, Virginia's a classic example. The governor can call them up. What does he do? Call me on the phone? Send somebody around with a bullhorn and a truck? I mean, what happens? There's nothing there. At least I haven't been told. So there's no organization to the extent that the average Virginian knows what he's supposed to do if he's called up by the governor, knows what equipment he's supposed to have, knows perhaps what training he might be able to go through. There's none of that. So if we have a major catastrophic event, EMP event, knocks down the electric grid, electricity is gone for 3 months, 6 months or whatever, when they're trying to rebuild this. Everything is in chaos. What happens? Well, 90% of the population, 95% of the population will be in chaos because we have not been organized, trained, equipped, and so forth to deal with this kind of an emergency. And we have all of these expensive bureaucracies in Washington, in Richmond, and whatever state capital you want to name. They're all sitting there. Have they made these plans? No. Or if they have, they're all secret. They certainly haven't told me. They haven't told the average person what these plans are. So the average person is sitting back, and if one of these crises occurs, his only hope will be, well, maybe he's planned something for himself. Maybe he's a prepper, as they say, right? He's capable of dealing with himself. But otherwise, he's going to have to depend upon his local government or his state government to bail him out. And do you think that they will be able to do that? Just look at their record. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, these tornadoes that occur in the Midwest. Do you really think that in a major nationwide emergency that we could depend upon FEMA or the various state little FEMAs? I think if you believe that, you're really, I mean, that's really childishly fooling yourself. That's not going to happen. And if we have a monetary crisis, which takes down the whole economy, how long might that, look at Greece, how long might that last? And are we prepared to deal with that? The answer is absolutely not. So the revitalization of the militia, bringing control, preparation, organization, training back to local people who can, in some manner, prepare to deal with these kinds of crises, is absolutely vital. And I would think that any presidential candidate or candidate for governor in a state who doesn't speak to this issue is really demonstrating his incompetence for that office. Because the crises are now in the, the dark clouds are now assembling very, very fast. We can begin to see the lightning on the horizon. And if we're not prepared, and our political leaders don't tell us that we need to be prepared, then we're going to be in a catastrophic situation. There is no state that I know of that has begun this process, certainly not in any legislation. I have talked to some legislators in various places who are interested in the subject, but they are really beginners. They're just learning. I wrote a book. What is it now? It's written in 2007, Constitutional Homeland Security. It's available on Amazon. And it focuses on how people at the local level should begin organizing themselves to learn about this subject, to recruit state legislators, to educate state legislators, and eventually to put pressure on state legislators to pass some kind of legislation. And if that kind of grassroots organizing is not done, then obviously we're never going to get anywhere, because this will not come from the top down. This is not going to be suggested by someone in the state legislature or in Congress. It's got to come from the bottom up. The beauty of organizing the way I suggest in this book is, even if the legislation is not passed, you organize a lot of people before the crisis comes. And that may have some real advantage, which you do not have now. Thirdly, the Oath Keepers group, if you know of that group, look up their website, Oath Keepers. They are in the process of organizing local people to deal with some of these possibilities. That's going on all over the country. These are primarily people who are at least former armed forces personnel, former police personnel, so they have that kind of a background, and they're looking at it from that perspective. But they are very serious in organizing and educating people at the neighborhood, really local level, neighborhood level, to prepare to deal with these kinds of crises that the various emergency management agencies are going to be incapable of dealing with. So those are the three levels, really. You've got to educate, you've got to organize locally, and ultimately you've got to recruit some people in the state legislature to do it. If it's not done at the state legislative level, it won't be done.
Thank you, Dr. Vieira.